Good morning. This is Huda FM. You are with your host, Z Train. Now, today's topic is going to be about the drug trade. The illegal drug trade, for those of you who don't know, is a global black market dedicated to the cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, and sale of drugs, which are subject to drug prohibition laws. Most jurisdictions prohibit trade, except under license, of many types of drugs by drug prohibition laws. A UN report said the global drug trade generated an estimated $321.6 billion in 2003. With the world GDP of $36 trillion in the same year, the illegal drug trade may be estimated as slightly less than 1% of the total global commerce. Now, consumption of illegal drugs is obviously widespread globally. To give a little history on this issue, addictive drugs were first prohibited in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. An illegal drug trade emerged during the 19th century, and China retaliated with imports of opium. Consequently, two opium wars broke out. In the first Opium War, the Chinese authorities had banned opium, but the United Kingdom forced China to allow British merchants to trade opium with the general population. Smoking opium had become common in the 19th century, and British merchants increased their trade with the Chinese. Trading in opium was, as it is today with heroin, extremely lucrative. Now, when this issue spilled over into the U.S., President Nixon eventually created the Drug Enforcement Agency, also known as the DEA. In many countries, drug smuggling carries severe penalties. These include lengthy periods of incarceration, flogging, and even the death penalty. Drug trafficking is widely regarded as the most serious of drug offenses around the world. However, sentencing often depends on the type of drug and its classification in the country into which it is being trafficked, the quantity trafficked, where the drugs are sold, and how they are distributed. For example, if the drugs are sold to underage people, then the penalties for trafficking may be harsher than in other circumstances. Although the media sporadically reports on major narcotic raids, the general consensus about the war on drugs is that small battles will not win this war. Despite all the money spent on drug enforcement worldwide, illicit drugs are relatively cheap and widely available. Increasingly, drugs are being viewed as a social problem rather than a strictly legal one. So, is it time to rethink traditional approaches to the illegal drug industry? Well, let's listen to an interview with Ron Paul where he discusses his standpoint on this issue.
Joining us now from Texas is former presidential candidate and Congressman Dr. Ron Paul. Thanks for joining us this morning, Congressman. Now, I know you have some strong ideas about how this country is conducting its war on drugs. We just heard from some of our viewers who strongly support legalizing marijuana. Do you think we should legalize pot alone or all drugs, including heroin, cocaine, and meth?
Well, I think we should look at the federal drug war, and I would say the federal drug war has failed, so we should reject it. When I talk about changing the law, I want to go back to the constitutional approach to a problem like this, and that is through the states. Up until 1937, there wasn't even a law against marijuana, and at that time they just passed a law to tax it. So we've had an experience in this country where we didn't have all these laws, but it was regulated by the states. Alcohol is legalized by the federal government, but it's regulated, by state laws. So I'm thinking more of an approach like that. But what upsets me so much is when the state tries to exert its authority over marijuana, like in California, they'll pass a law and say that sick people can use it. So people who are dying with AIDS or cancer are getting benefit from marijuana. Then the federal government comes in and says, we don't care about the state law. And they just override and they put people into prison for this. We have now over 500,000 people in prison that never committed a violent crime for drug use. And there are mandatory jail sentences under these conditions. This makes no sense. It's so expensive and it hasn't achieved anything.
So let me just get your position on this, though. You think the federal government should just stay out of trying to legalize all drugs? And that's not just marijuana, but all drugs?
Right, and I would let the states deal with it. It would be a state issue on how they do it. I recall as a youngster when I worked in a drugstore, I sold codeine and cough medicine over the counter. I could buy it as a teenager, and it wasn't a drug problem. So it isn't the lack of laws that causes the drug problem. I mean, the real drug problem and disaster in this country is alcohol and nicotine. That's what's killing people. So we're dealing with the minutia, but we're creating a monstrous legal problem costing hundreds of billions of dollars and putting people in prison that should be treated as sick people. They shouldn't be treated as criminals. We treat alcoholics. What if we put all our alcoholics in prison? I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. Prohibition of alcohol was the biggest absurdity, social absurdity, and it committed a lot of crime. Back then, it was the borders between the United States and Canada. That's where the alcohol was coming in, from Canada back there in Prohibition. Now it's Mexico. But the problems we have is because the price of these drugs is about 1,000 times greater than it would be. Actually, some of this stuff is useless if it's just allowed to be out in the open. So we've created most of the problems for ourselves, and these drug wars are a consequence of our policies.
All right, well, let me just ask you this. Is there
Now, his viewpoint has become very popular within the United States, as even Denver has had efforts toward legalizing marijuana. Now, frustration with the drug policy status quo, the horrific levels of trafficking-related violence in Mexico and Central America, and the fiscal, personal, and social costs of imprisoning 500,000 drug dealers in the U.S., has led to calls for some form of legalization. Recently, at the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena, President Barack Obama got an earful from his Latin American counterparts about the need to reverse the U.S. drug policy. The appeal of legalization is clear, obviously. At a stroke, it would wipe out most of the black market by depriving gun-wielding thugs of their competitive advantage. But for it to work, it would have to include not just the possession of drugs, but their production as well. And not just of marijuana, but of substances that are really of dangerous potential, such as cocaine, crack, heroin, and methamphetamine. Now, legalizing possession and production would eliminate many of the problems related to drug dealing, but it would certainly worsen the problem of drug abuse. We could abolish the illicit market in cocaine as we abolished the illicit market in alcohol, but does anyone consider our current alcohol policies a success? Well, that's for you to decide. And tune in next time on Huda FM.